Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Workflow and Process Security, Checking the Locks. I'm Teresa Resick, Director of Webinars here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. And with me today are Marco Salanpa of BMO Consulting and David Fisher from Brother International. Brother International is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them for their support. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. Before we get started, I just want to offer a few pointers for viewing today's webinar. By joining our webinars live, you can customize your own viewing experience, so feel free to open, close, or resize the different windows you have available to you. Across the bottom of your screen is a list of all of the widgets that are available to you today. Group Chat is one of those widgets that are available to you, and you will need to open that. That's not already open on your desktop. So you just click on the widget, one of the Group Chat widget icon, and you'll be able to join the conversation with your fellow attendees and also with a few of us here at AIIM. And just be aware that everybody can see everything we're posting in here together. So look forward to hearing from you throughout the hour. But do ask questions of the speakers throughout that hour using our Q&A feature. And we will hold these questions until the end, where we should have about 5 or 10 minutes to answer them. You can also use this feature to ask for technical assistance. You can download a PDF of the presentation at any time. Just look to the resources list that's to the right of the slide area. There's also a few other documents and links in there to help you learn more about today's topic. Just click in there at any time, and those resources will open in a new browser tab. Then you can save them and read them after the webinar. At the end of the webinar, a brief survey will open in your browser, and it's greatly appreciated if you take a few moments to offer your feedback and suggest other topics for us to cover. You can also access this survey. It's already open at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in just a few days. So right now, I'd like to introduce our featured speakers that we have with us today. And first, I would like to introduce Marco Salanpa, who's the founder of BMO Consulting. And BMO Consulting is an advisory group that looks at the ECM landscape from both the customer and vendor perspectives. Just saying 18 years of experience in enterprise content management is not enough. Marco started in ECM before the term existed. He worked in enterprise document management, developing solutions to manage large collections of regulatory documents. He was the first person at Documentum to develop a web content management solution back in 1998 and was a key member of the team during its transition into the WCM and ultimately ECM. He supported acquisition strategies around digital asset management, records management, collaboration, imaging, and report generation. He has developed partner strategies and business plans for various ancillary ECM technology vendors. And we also have with us today David Fisher, and David is the Senior Product Marketing Manager for Scanner Products for Brother International. And along with extensive experience in the imaging space, David has completed the AIIM Capture Specialist Certificate Program, and his knowledge providing the physical on-ramp to a digital transformation has helped organizations select hardware to improve their workflow, increase their security controls, and meet their compliance requirements. So right now, I am going to turn things over to Marco to begin our discussion today. Marco?
Thank you, Teresa. So today we wanted to talk a little bit more about workflow. I think as we look to implement ECM or document management solutions, one of the biggest value points is to implement some sort of processes around those documents. And typically when we start looking at those areas, we start really with 3 questions. Who needs to access this document? What do those individuals need to do with that document? And when do they need to do it? But when we're looking at high-value documents, we really need to add a couple more questions. What is the value of this document? And what if somebody else sees this document? So I'd like to start off with a quick question to ask yourselves, which do you think is more valuable? An armored van with $1 million or 1 million Social Security records inside of a records van? When you think about those two, the way we handle those 2 assets, you have 2 drivers, usually armed, moving $1 million around. But when you're moving around Social Security records or health records in a records van, you really don't have that level of security. And so it's kind of interesting to find out that pretty much 1 million Social Security records is equal to $1 million. But when we start looking at some other documents those costs those costs start to increase. So if we look at, for instance, HIPAA violations, which are your healthcare records, if an individual healthcare record gets exposed by accident, that could cost you anywhere from $100 to $50,000. For I-9 documents for all your employees, if you're going through and get called in for an I-9 audit, that could cost you anywhere from $110 to $1,100 per record. GDPR violations, if you're looking at the global data privacy regulations that are coming in from Europe, if you accidentally release personally identifiable information about an individual, you could easily be charged with 3% of your worldwide revenue. And in addition to these sort of areas where you have direct costs, there's other sort of costs that sometimes pop up. If you look at FERPA, for instance, which is the deals with Family Education Privacy Act. In those cases, if you're an educational institution and you accidentally release student records, you could lose your funding from the U.S. government. So, when we look at paper, it really is, there is a dollar number that we need to consider with these. So as we're looking at defining our workflows, we need to think about that. The other question I want to ask is, who do you think causes more data breaches? The average employee or your black hat, your hacker guy? Surprisingly, the employee is the one that often causes data breaches. Now, we're not talking about giant malicious data breaches, but just even accidental breaches. And so, when you look at it that way, you see 85% of the employees in a survey by Entrepreneur Magazine said that they admit taking company documents that they created. I think a lot of us think that the documents that we create for our employers are our own documents, and really those are assets of that employer. 30% admit to taking documents that they didn't create. And a lot of this is because most people don't recognize that there's a policy associated to this, and so that's something that we really need to consider as we're addressing documents. So when we're looking at highly valuable documents, the way to identify what those are is we need to ask 4 questions. Is this information publicly available? If we accidentally release this, is this something we would be concerned about? Is there a regulatory requirement to keep this? We were talking about the fines associated to documents. If you're publicly traded, you have Sarbanes-Oxley that you have to worry about, you have to consider. So all those come in and have you are ways to look at that document's value. Are those documents tied to the bottom line? Do they contain competitive advantage? So, for instance, looking at contracts. Do you want your contract? What happens if somebody sees a vendor contract that you have with another vendor? So, all of those are things that we need to look at when we're considering what our highly valuable documents are. Once we identified our high-value documents, we need to take an extra look at what we're doing with those. We want to make sure that the right people are involved. Are the right processes being followed, and is the right technology being used? So let's start with people. This may seem obvious, but every year there's a couple stories out there where people didn't quite know who their employees were. A story comes into mind from a California city where an individual that was an administrator over one system had a disagreement with his employer and basically locked them out of the application for several months as they tried to go through and figure out how to get back into the application. It's critical for people to know who their employees are. Make sure that you have backups for your key employees. This makes obvious sense, but we don't necessarily think about that when we look at systems. Do we make sure that if we have an individual, how do we have their password on hand in case we need to get into their account? Another thing to look at is things like separating your administrator role from your individual account. Sometimes we give administrator privileges to an individual, and when they go in and they're doing their normal daily business, they may make a slight change, and that change suddenly affects the whole entire process. I'm reminded of several years back when I was at a customer site on a sales call of all things, and in the middle of that process, we found out that a bunch of records had suddenly popped up on the company's intranet They were made available through a search engine, and it was all ultimately discovered that it was because of an individual change in a security policy done by an administrator when they thought they were only working on their own private documents. And as we look at the individual, I think there's another area that we can address is looking at having employees bonded. This is a common topic or a common thing that you see in banking, for instance, where tellers or people that are directly handling cash have an insurance policy associated to them. Usually, it's something like a fidelity policy, and so there may be options to have key employees bonded. So in case something does happen, you have some insurance against that. Now, looking at people alone isn't enough. You also need to look at your processes. One of the big things is making sure that you can conduct regular training on compliance. You may need to make sure that you have your employees sign off on those documents, and sometimes it's even best to make sure that they go through and run a test on what they read to make sure that they actually comprehended what was there. So, a lot of people will just simply see a policy document and just acknowledge it and sign off immediately. The next question then looks at how often do you actually run audits of your critical processes? Do you look at your audit logs? Do you go through and look at your documents to see who's changing attributes? Why are they changing attributes? Those are things that should be regularly performed against your workflows. Looking for a workflow process that gets forwarded as an ad hoc task to somebody else. And I think one great piece of technology that's starting to emerge in this space is artificial intelligence, where we could actually go through and start running these audit logs through some sort of an AI process to find abnormalities in the audit logs to see if there's something happening that we should be aware of. Next, we need to look at technology. We need to understand what the limitations of our platforms are. We need to know what the positives are. And we also need to know what the negatives are. Quite often, we look at the plus side of a platform, but we don't necessarily look for where there might be some challenges. So when we're looking at technology, I like to do several things. One, I like to look at designing for the bad actor. We often look at a workflow and say, who needs to use this document inside accounting? Who needs to sign off on this document? And we don't necessarily consider a bad actor. Now, a bad actor doesn't have to be an individual that's actually acting maliciously. These can be accidental ones. Thinking back to that example that I gave of the administrator that changed the document permission that ended up opening up a lot of other documents that they didn't intend to do. That's something that we need to consider. I mean, if you go through looking at a contract, for instance, you may have a high-value partner that you have a contract that you don't necessarily want every employee to see, but somebody sees whether that's going through. You may not want everybody to see it, but so you may want to actually look at those sorts of documents and recognize that maybe for high-value contracts, you need to go through and have a slightly different workflow processes. And the other thing you want to kind of think about is searches can reveal everything. When I showed my notes to Teresa, I originally had this writing, avoid full text search results, and I realized I needed to change that because everybody talks about full text search results, but I've seen systems where the full text search results return a paragraph of text. And sometimes within that inline paragraph of text that's being returned, there could be some rather interesting information that gets presented. So if you're looking for things like PII, you may accidentally expose PII, or you may accidentally expose a price that you didn't intend to, because that's how that system returns its results. Looking at documents and protecting them at their source, I think one of the things that we look at. I'm talking about imaging here and how we bring documents in. We quite often organizations look at building a digital mailroom. The idea is that we just convert that single mailroom process and digitize every single document that comes in, which requires somebody going through and opening the envelope and looking at all the documents. And as you start merging those processes that may have been separate, the idea suddenly becomes, let's have one digital mailroom, but really you should probably consider having multiple ones. You think about, for instance, going back to the banking example, a bank may often have one mail facility where you get all general mail for the bank, and another one where you actually get checks and other fiduciary instruments. So you may want to consider having a separate digital mailroom for contracts, or a separate digital mailroom for your health documents. The other thing to think about is what are you doing with your scanning? For high value documents that you want to make sure that you only have one copy of, do you want to send those documents first to a network share where those documents are then picked up by your document management system or an FTP site? If you're required to do that, you probably should make sure that that location is encrypted, so that you don't accidentally leave documents out there that, again, somebody just accidentally happens to go click on that network directory, now suddenly sees a whole bunch of student records, for instance. Protecting documents at distribution, we look at things like, as you're sending electronic documents, reports, financial contracts. Look at things like digital rights management. Digital rights management basically creates a wrapper around a document, and you can timestamp or expire those documents. Some systems will even allow you to see who's opening those documents by requiring them to have that individual to have a password that's available, and they may have a server environment, so you can see when somebody's opening up a document that's out there in the public. The timestamp, the expiration dates are really can be very interesting. You can go through and publish a document that's only available for a month, and then have that document. The binary will still exist, but you won't be able to open that document after that month. World read permission. I think this is when you look at how you're defining your architecture for your documents. Sometimes people start thinking that we want this document management. We want our document management system to be a way for everybody to be able to share documents. So we may lock down the edit permissions, but we may suddenly say that any user of this system can do world read. At the beginning, that may be a very valid option, but as you start growing and more documents start coming into the system, now you have to go back and try to figure out, as we're adding new users, should those new users see some of those old documents? If you may end up having a large data conversion just because you're starting to add a couple new users. And again, I touch on this view of let's see make sure that what we're addressing from our search results is accurate. I talked about full text search, but also looking at your attributes and your keywords that are being returned from a query, making sure that some of those may suddenly pop up a piece of data. You may have a business partner that you don't want to necessarily have everyone know who's there, but because you're using a pick list that automatically gets populated by all your vendor names, that vendor name suddenly shows up on that as a query option. So those are all things to address. There's some ways you can protect documents as you're looking at them from a print distribution perspective. We like to think about things being all electronic, but there are business processes quite often where a paper document becomes much more valuable. You may have standard operating procedures for equipment that you want to make sure that are available where someone doesn't have to go run and look at an electronic copy. So I've quite often seen print watermarks associated with those documents. Those can tie back to compliance aspects that state that printed copy is not the official record copy, or I've seen print options where they say that the document is valid for a short period of time, but this ensures that you don't have a physical document sitting around that people are referencing for business purposes because you've set an expiration date on that. Even while you're printing those documents, if you think about how kind of the reduction in paper that's occurring, you're starting to have fewer shared printers or output devices throughout an organization. So those documents that you're printing now may end up several offices away from you, and so when you just go off and print a document, what information is on that document? So a lot of the multifunction devices now have the ability, for instance, to go through and require a password to print. So you can send the the print job to the printer, but it doesn't get printed until you actually show up and type a password. So those are things to think about as you're looking at print distribution of documents. And then, from a storage perspective, how do you ensure that the storage of those documents is being handled for high value documents? Thinking about things like the network share. You definitely don't want to use just a network share for high value documents. There's not a lot of controls associated with those. So how do you, go making sure that you're putting in some sort of a document management system in place? But even then, how do you make sure that that document system is able to, making sure that that document system storage of those documents is encrypted? So in some cases, you may encrypt the drive. Other cases, you may want to go through and encrypt the documents. So looking at how you're storing those documents becomes critical for high-value documents. Some of the other things you might want to consider as you're looking at high-value documents are separate repositories. There is quite often folks, organizations look to have one repository for all of their documents, but it may make more sense to have a repository for accounting documents or for HR documents. When you have these separate repositories, you can ensure that certain users aren't given permission. I mean, if you don't want HR documents available outside of HR, you create an HR repository with only HR users in that repository. That way, you don't have challenges with people accidentally seeing documents because they're not even able to access that collection. Separate disconnected networks. If you have really valuable documents, you may have a complete subnet where your repository is located, so no one's able to access those documents. I've seen situations where organizations have had not only a separate disconnected network, but a separate physical location to connect to certain document sets. You had to go in and sign in to use one of the computers in that room, and you could go through, retrieve the documents that you need to retrieve, take a look at those, for your reference purposes, but you weren't allowed to save it. You weren't allowed to take copies of it. As we look at things like ensuring the retention of documents, you may want to consider things like write once, read many storage. How do I go through and ensure that those documents aren't being edited? So in a lot of cases, a write one, read many, a worm storage device is an option to ensure that those documents aren't being edited for a long period of time. And there's a lot of promises right now being made by blockchain. The idea for those of you that aren't familiar with blockchain is that storing transactions and pieces of transactions in multiple repositories and storing other transactions on top of those creates a much more secure environment where you would ultimately have to go through and change multiple records to change an original record. So there's talks about using blockchain in areas like contracts management. And so as we're looking at some of these more valuable documents, there's definitely other ways to start addressing them. Another thing that I kind of like to touch on is looking at rogue administrators. I think that every so often there's a story about a rogue administrator coming into play. So one of the things to consider is network admins don't necessarily need to see everything that someone's doing. Sometimes you're sharing an account, or they're looking. Some administrators have the ability to watch over what you're doing on your computer screen. With certain sensitive documents, those users may have to be excluded from that list. If someone's working on a merger document, for instance, do you want someone, can an administrator take a look at that? What happens to that person? Because they may not have that need to know. Looking at the activity of the administrator every day. Does your audit group or your IT management take a look and see what your administrator's been doing with their account? Why were they in the system? Why did they change these document permissions? If you're not looking at your audit trails on a daily basis, a lot of things can the issues can expand. Looking at there was a Department of Labor report that talked about internal crime, stating that usually when a person decides to do something, an employee decides to do something, it's not something that they did one day, and usually they don't get caught for several years. And so in the report it was saying usually it takes about 3 years for a mistake, for an issue to get caught. So by looking at your audit logs every day, you get around that. And then, I talked about separating the administrator role from the administrator as the individual, so using an administrator account. The other thing that you may want to consider is how do you protect that password? One of the things I like is looking now at a two-factor authentication. So you go through and speak you go through and enter your password, and an email gets notified to someone that password account is being used. If it was if it was your regular user account, it'd be really hard to keep up with all the different changes that are all the activity that individual is doing. But if you're using an individual administrator account, you're getting notifications each time they use that password. But maybe your system doesn't have a two-factor authentication. Another very easy thing to do is using something like a split password rule. It's very common in physical kind of environments where, for instance, you're trying to share a lock in a vault. So the idea here is that you would have two individuals. Typically, you'd have two individuals that would share a password. Someone would know the first 4 characters of the password. Somebody else would know the next 4 characters of that password. And this way, it requires 2 individuals to come in and make changes to an account. So that way, again, you're knowing why someone's going in to use that administrator account. In summary, I think one of the things we need to do is we're looking at workflows. We need to recognize that all documents aren't created equal. We need to really look at the value of those documents and kind of see which documents need extra protection, need some extra concerns, and then as we identify those documents, we need to look and make sure are those right controls in place to manage that document and in accordance with that document's value. Thank you. And Teresa, I think you have a poll question or two?
Yes, I do. Thank you. We've been listening to Marcos Lampa here. Just asking everyone in the audience to come up to their keyboards and answer this question for us. Do you or your organization regularly conduct security audits of your document workflows? And the answer choices here are yes, we perform internal audits to monitor our document security. Yes, we utilize external resources to monitor and audit our document security. No, we do not have document security audit program in place, or you just don't know. So please come up, select an answer here, and I'm just going to invite our next speaker, David Fisher, to join us as we take a peek at the answers here. And I'm going to go ahead and take a look at that. And just, David, just curious if when you first start working with different organizations, are these the typical types of results that you see?
Yeah, I would say this is very typical, a little bit shy on the performing internal audits. Typically, I expect that to be a little bit higher. Surprised to see that upwards of 40% or almost 40% don't have a program in place. So all of the points that Marco had made earlier I think come into play here and are important for consideration, because again, how you're looking at that information and who's looking at that information, you really want to know and take a look at those document security workflows a little bit closer. So a little bit not surprised to see people aren't using external resources, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But yeah, a little surprised that it's as low as 25%, but that's good. That's why you're here today, to learn a little bit about what needs to be done in your document security workflow.
Well, David, go ahead and continue on with your presentation then.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is David Fisher. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager for Scanners at Brother International. So we're going to look a little bit about the actual device and document security solutions. And we kind of look at this in essentially 3 different places that we want to look at in terms of who has access and to what when you're developing that security plan. We talk about device access security, document security, and then the security of the network. Because again, it's also important to recognize that you're not just protecting that record at rest and that information at rest. It's very important that you're looking at that information and protecting it while it is in transit. And you know, a lot of this secure information is in transit to external individuals. You know, you might be communicating confidential information to an outside vendor, and it's not just where it resides. So it's an important aspect that we'll touch upon as well. But in terms of the device access, you know, Marco touched on a couple of points earlier, and it's important to recognize a lot of the hardware that you find in the market today, from scanners and MFPs, have a number of security controls built right into the device. So you can securely lock down individual functions on devices. For brother devices, I know specifically, you know, when you can control who can scan to different network folders. So you, as Marco mentioned, you don't want to just open up everybody to have access to be able to scan to shared folders, but you know, some groups and some work groups will require it. So it's nice to have a device where you can actually lock down the controls at the device to who can scan to which destinations. And in today's environments, you'll find a lot of card authentication as well. So you can look at integrating some of the technology that you'll find in NFC cards, or even NFC chips within the smartphones today, being integrated into recognition at the device, or external HID card readers. A lot of devices, hardware devices today, we actually provide a custom user interface, so you can actually just change the panel. Right, on a lot of the machines have touch panels, and you can integrate security controls right into those touch panels as well. And again, make sure that your devices do allow you to monitor the activity, not just control the access of the device, but monitor the print activity logs or the scan job email reports. And you know, you want to be able to track. It's nice to have authentication, you know, Active Directory lookup and authentication, but the admin needs to be able to track who's being looked up and authenticated on that that device as well. And then when we talk about the document security, again, you know, a lot of organizations and large enterprises are moving to these hybrid cloud solutions where they have an on-prem storage as well as cloud, public and private cloud storage. So you want to make sure that you know you have a device that is encrypting to that server during the scan transmission, and looking at you know the storage print and job release and secure print. Because again, a lot of the devices today, or the line of business owners today, are going to require access to those clouds and those shared drives. But securely monitoring the document itself as to who can print it, how it can be printed, where it can be printed, who can scan it, where it can be scanned, and then how is it scanned, and are you scanning securely and you know, having signed PDF formats, for instance, things of that nature. So there's a number of ways that you can protect the actual document security that you definitely want to be looking into as you build your security plan as well. And then, as we mentioned, also the network security, right? So is the firmware digitally signed? Are digital certificates supported? You know, and again, when you're looking at your network security, it's also for visitors that are coming into your buildings, and how are they being treated? If they need to print a document, you have devices that support Wi-Fi Direct. Things like Wi-Fi Direct, that'll allow mobile devices to print and scan without connecting to the main network. So you can actually just go up and allow somebody to print off of a shared device without actually having to be on the network, which, again, you don't want to necessarily give a network key to every user that comes into your building. So allowing that permission to be granted for the ease of use of your visitors and your line of business owners when they have outside folks coming in, but still making sure that the key network settings are integrated into a security schema. And additionally, the devices, you want to make sure that your network security is allowing you to filter by IP. Again, you don't necessarily want to have everybody with access to the devices, and when you're controlling who can access what by IP filter, you can restrict or grant access based on the IP. That's a very unique and easy way to do that. So we work with a company called the SANS Institute, and this is security consulting firm, and they work with what's called the Center for Internet Security, developed top 20 security controls. And again, this is really when you're building out that security, when 40% of you have said you don't have a security schema in place today, a couple of the key things that you want to look at, this is a list of the top 20 critical security controls we use here at Brother. And this is a kind of an industry standard from our IT security director worked with me and kind of laid out for us how they use these controls. And really, some of the most important parts on here, when you look at number 19 and number 20, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when these data breaches happen. So it's really having that incident response and management in place beforehand. And then actually those penetration tests and red team exercises. What we were asking about an external audit is because that's something that we employ here at Brother. We actually bring in annually a group of ethical hackers that come in and are given kind of the permissions that they need to go in and hack in and see if they can get into our castle. And that's something our IT security department does is work with these external groups to actually have them come in, because again, if you're internally monitoring your own process, that you can develop sort of a myopia to that and maybe not want to see some of the issues that are occurring or just overlook it. It's your program and your audit and your audit trail, and it's not as always easy to find your own mistakes or your own potential pitfalls. But when you bring in some of the outside perspective to take a look at how that information is being accessed and who can get in there, that outside perspective and bringing in an external resource to audit that system is really another very critical place to ensure that you have the critical controls in place. So you can see this list includes things like we talked about earlier, and data protection is huge, and the security training and skills assessment, again, not just signing off on a document, but actually go ahead and give them that quiz and make sure that they know how to what the policy is and how to integrate it into their workflow. Because again, at the end of the day, we're faced with the challenge of the application in the workplace, right? Your line of business owners are going to scan and print to and from mobile and desktop devices. They want to use these shared folders. They want to be on mobile print and using cloud services. They're going into OneBox and OneDrive and Dropbox and Evernote and all of the rest. And a lot of these devices are integrating third-party applications, right into the touch panel. Your invoice processing departments want to have, a simple way to scan an invoice or receive an electronic invoice and have that kick off a digital workflow without having to, manage all of the printouts and the paper. And these challenges are really what's going to create a lot of those pitfalls and those holes in your security. And you really need to involve the line of business owners as you're building out this your security protocols, because they will find workarounds if they are not given the security controls that they need in order to get the job done. So it is important that you're using these top 20 critical controls when you're building out that security schema. And just as an example of how these kind of work in the real world, we did a case study. We had a financial services firm that essentially is looking at a number of branch offices and regional offices providing federal and state income tax return preparation. You've seen these types of organizations in your Walmarts and in your mini malls and strip malls where they have income tax preparation services and branch locations, and then they have regional offices that they need to scan and print all these devices to, and then they have to submit these documents into the federal government and submit these documents into their corporate office and print labels and print documents. So there's a lot of needs for a financial services company when it comes to providing them with scanning and printing solutions for their branch locations and integrating that workflow between branch, regional office, and corporate office, and trying to save them money on sending all of these documents via parcel and truck and that sort of thing as well. And if you look at it, I mean, this is a fairly simple workflow, but when we go to take a look at it, essentially a customer comes to this branch office and has their information done for their tax preparation, and in that branch office they need to scan that information in and into their own user interface, and then they have it actually scanned and then sent to the regional offices. Well, within the regional office, you want to make sure who has access to print that job, who can output which, to which user, because then they're going to take that information. In some cases, they have to make printing and mailing labels right off of that same information, and they're going to be able to print the mailing labels for sending it into corporate and sending the documents into the government agencies where the tax prep documents need to take place. And then, again, once it goes over to corporate, they might have to print it out there, again, using securely. They want to scan it to a searchable PDF and store it in a cloud service device. They were using Google Drive, and allows any individual to come and actually, have that ability to print and scan that or review that searchable PDF off of that network drive or that shared drive account. So you can see all the different places in this very simple workflow where you have potential for security protocols to be needed and in place as you're sending that very critical customer information from point A to B to C to D within this workflow. So this is again, where we worked with a financial services tax preparation company and developed a scanning and printing solution for them. That you can see all the different areas within this very simple workflow that you really need to pay critical control to those security controls. So again, just some of the key takeaways here. You really want to focus on that digital content. When I say end users, it's really your line of business owners or your end users typically, and they're consuming this technology very differently. And these devices are the on-ramps to digital workflows. So secure scan and capture is becoming really increasingly important. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Teresa to take us through any questions. And if you want to see more information on where you can find some information on Brothers Solutions for document sharing strategies, you can please visit us at brother-usa.com/connect. And I believe there's the link for this in your in the application here that you can review. And we also have a white paper in there for you to take a look at that's really geared around advanced capture solutions in the K-12 environment. But just know that that white paper has some really interesting information to share, not only just in K-12 education, but it really talks a little bit about, or quite a bit about digital natives, right? We're all growing into the workforce now, and coming into the workforce are folks that are basically coming in digital native. They didn't have that analog background that many of us had to start their careers. They're starting with smartphones and document sharing services, like Box and Dropbox and Google Drive. So it's a different set of individual mindset that's coming in here. So that just if you're not in K-12, you still might want to take a peruse through that white paper and see how it addresses the digital natives.
Well,
and with that, I believe I will turn it back over to Teresa.
Yes, thanks. And we've been listening here to David Fisher of Brother International. And yes, it's in the resources list. It's on the right side of your desktop there for the links to not only the solutions for the document sharing strategy, but also that white paper that you mentioned. And also in that resources list is a link over to Marco's blog. He's, in addition to everything else he does, he's a prolific blogger. I always enjoy reading what he writes. And frankly, it was one of his blog posts said, I wanted Marco to talk on this webinar. So I invite you to go over and read what he regularly shares. So just wanted to mention that to you. And let me get over to, we have a few questions that have been coming in here, and I invite you to go over and to submit the questions that you have. And let me go ahead and start with this first one here. And Marco, I'm going to put this out to you first. Someone's asking about, for the people that have been do have data security plans in place, how frequently should they be reviewing these data security procedures and practices and the policies that they have?
I mean, I think you need to at least review them annually. I think that's at a minimum. Depending on how critical some of your data is, you may want to do this more often. But an annual review should be should be run. You also need to consider whenever a new system comes in place, or you're making some changes to the network. Those are definitely other times when you want to go through and look at what those security procedures are, or changes in individuals in administration roles, just to make sure that those policies are still in place. And so typically you'll find yourself doing them once or twice a year, once kind of on a regular annual basis, and then for some other reason you'll have another review sometime at some point during the year.
Okay. When it comes to like changes that crop up down the line, if it's not this regular review cycle, things like regulatory issues, different things that come up, whether it's through specific to their industry or just data security regulations in general. What kind of practices, how should someone work to weave these new requirements into existing plans? What are some strategies for planning and implementing things like that?
I think if you look. I can do that. I think if you look at documents and you kind of look at them from a value perspective, I think you kind of start falling into these buckets that are already being addressed, that ultimately get addressed by new regulations coming into play. I mean, if you think about personally identifiable information and GDPR popping up these days, the concept of what GDPR has been there to protect has been a question for people at all times. So I mean, if you look at it and go, okay, I need to make sure that I have personal information locked, have those under some sort of control. Usually usually that there will be something already there. What we end up often seeing though is where those changes, where a change starts coming in, and I think some of the more interesting ones were looking at like retention requirements. At one point you may have longer retention requirements, and then rules may change, and now you have shorter retention requirements, and how do you change those specifically? And so I think if you look at your document types and kind of look at those collections, you can start identifying which ones will have some sort of regulatory value. I mean, ultimately, if you think of a document as an asset and as it having value, I think you kind of work around some of the you're already addressing those requirements by understanding what the value is. Looking at like a student record or a health record, that should be there should be some decent controls over it. Looking at accounting records, it's similar sort of thing. So I think as you start looking at the new policies and new controls that you start putting in place, I think it's just more of an enhancement on how you're looking at documents. As long as as long as you've started by treating every document as equal.
Okay, that's a good point there. Yes, it does. Thank you. David, I want to direct this next question over to you. Someone's asking about, for those who said that they do not have the security plans in place, and realizing that they can't build this in a vacuum, or they alone can't start building these plans, but it needs to bring the right team together. How do you start with bringing the right team of people together to examine the existing needs and building those practices? Who should be included?
Yeah, that's a very good point, very valid to discuss. Exactly. Who needs to be involved. What's critical here, I think, first is if you don't have a plan in place today and you don't have a security policy in place, pick a workflow or pick an area, and it can be very specific if need be, to start with. If you don't have a policy and a program in place, to do it as an organizational level and say, we're going to put something in place for our HR and accounting and legal and everything all at one time is just going to be too much, and you're setting yourself up for failure. So I think most important is to find that critical area within your business and start kind of small and get some wins under your belt as you're building it out. So whether it's whether it's just accounts payable or just accounts receivable, or within HR, maybe it's just the new employee onboarding, or just in the recruiting process, wherever it might be, that you pick that one specific area, and really in addition to making sure that you're bringing in the proper people from your IT security, IT department that might manage this, it's also critical to involve the line of business owners in the policy itself, because if you get buy-in from them and they understand the need and the risks and what's at stake and how they can help protect the company's assets, you'll get a lot more, you'll get a lot better change management, a lot less resistance, especially if you do it on a small scale. So find that team that's going to be easier to work with. Maybe it's the marketing department. We're pretty nice folks typically. But find that department and get those those key line of business owners that are really going to advocate for that policy to be in place. But of course, it really is going to require the buy-in from the C-level as well. This isn't something that is really going to happen from the ground up. You're really going to make sure that this needs to get on the roadmap of your strategy officer or your chief technology officer, that this is something that and show them from the cost perspective. I mean, I think there's a couple of good points that Marco brought up in terms of the fines that are in place for some of these mishandled records, and just some of the data on we harken back to Marco's points on 85% of these employees are taking data with them when they leave the company. I mean, I think that'll really resonate with your C-level management. So you need to get that the buy-in from the senior leadership, and not just their buy-in, but their commitment that it's truly the right ROI for the company, and then it's really finding those key line of business owners that are going to help you get those small wins, so that when you roll this out at scale, the change management will be that much smoother.
And I just wanted to say, I think when you're looking. Yes. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say, David's point is excellent about having the business users in there, and sometimes they pop up with some interesting questions that you didn't actually see. The need to know comes to mind. I remember talking to a contracts group once, and they mentioned just in passing, there were certain contracts that they didn't want anybody else in the contracts department to see, and so that was an extra level of security that we just had to make sure that we added to that workflow, so that these high value vendors weren't just given access, just anyone in the organization wasn't able to see these high-value contracts.
Yes, certainly the line of business people know their jobs best, and getting their input is critical. Well, I just wanted to mention a couple other things here, just because we're getting close to the end of our webinar hour. AIM, in the very beginning, David mentioned in his introduction, I mentioned that David has taken our Capture Certificate program, and I've taken a few of these classes ourselves. So AIM does offer a variety of training for you, whether in person, online. We can come to your organization for some customized training, and actually our training department is offering a special, it's actually only good until the end of this week because it was just our August promotion, for unlimited training available to you. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, and you have a couple of days to make your decision to complete that unlimited training purchase, just go ahead and there is a link in the resources to that. I can have Michelle Clark give you a call just to follow up with you and answer any questions that you might have about any of our programs. Michelle knows everything about our training programs, and she's a great resource. So just wanted to mention that to avail yourselves to that. Also, as you may or may not realize, AIM 18, our next annual conference, is coming up in the beginning of the year, and we are having our call for speakers is open right now, and the application deadline is September 29th. So if you have a compelling story to share about your digital transformation, and you think it's worth one sharing with your fellow colleagues, consider speaking. And so just check out this link on the AIM conference website and for the call for speakers, and encourage you to submit your application to speak at our annual conference. And I just wanted to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded, and it is going to be available in the next day or two in the AIIM.org's resources webinars page. Don't forget to download the resources that we do have available for you right now, and to take the brief survey that's going to open up on your desktop when the webinar concludes, or you can click on that at the bottom of your screen as well. I greatly value your feedback and would love to hear from you from this. And very much want to thank our underwriter, Brother International. Without the support from our solution providers, AIM wouldn't be able to bring you these free educational programs. So thank you, Brother, for your sponsorship. And just want to end our webinar and on just letting each of our speakers offer their closing thoughts or a key takeaway. And I'm going to start first with David Fisher from Brother International. Your closing thought today.
Yeah, I just, again, want to just thank you all for attending today, and thanks, AIM, for putting this together. And just a reminder that this is, we're really the Internet of Things, the proliferation of devices that are connected, the way that these devices are being engaged in the workforce. It's critical that that you really take a strong look at how these devices are being used as on-ramps to your digital workflows, and make sure that they're achieving all of the security protections that you're going to need to make sure that you mitigate the risk that's out there today.
Thank you. And Marco Salampa of BMO Consulting, your closing thoughts today.
Yes, thanks, Teresa, and thanks, AIM, for organizing, and thank you, Brother, for sponsoring this. I think the one thing I'd like everyone to kind of take away from this is that every document isn't created equal, and I think we kind of often just look at documents as pieces of paper, but if we look at the information that's on there, I think we'll not only see that documents have a value to them, but they may even start becoming assets based on the kind of information that's stored in them. And so when you think of a document as an asset and how do you try to make sure you protect those assets, I think you get a different view of how the workflow and just accessibility to those documents play out. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. And everyone, thank you for joining us today. For AIM, this is Teresa Resick, and we will see you with our next webinar. Have a good afternoon.